Amazing. Thanks, Lisa. So, before I hand over to Grace Preston, who has authored this review, very briefly, you all know why we're here today because you signed up for the event. But this is the latest in our evidence review series. It's the Romani, Roma, and Irish traveller communities and the criminal justice system. And Grace has written a really brilliant review that synthesises a lot of the evidence on these issues. The way that the session is going to work is that at any second now, I'm going to hand over to Grace to run you through the review. I then have a couple of questions for Grace. And then in the second half of the session, we're going to hand over to Russell, who will manage the questions from all of you guys in the crowd, we're not in public, in the virtual room. So when it gets to that point, please do share your questions and then Russell will expertly manage it. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand over to Grace Preston. Grace, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Sam, and thanks so much to Clinks and to Russell for reaching out to give us the chance of sort of getting this review together. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the review, but essentially it looks at sort of 3 separate ethnic groups and their experiences with the criminal justice system and the evidence out there about those experiences. So kind of a key aspect of the review was really highlighting those kind of data gaps that exist, and we were literally just talking about it right before I walked into the room. So the communities that the traveller movement work with are ethnic communities that are protected under the Equality Act. So those are Romani Gypsies, or sometimes called English Gypsies, Roma, and Irish travellers. And so what I think is important to note is that often the term GRT is kind of used, it's the language of state, it's used by most departments and most secondary organisations outside of sort of the quote-unquote GRT areas, the NGO space. So in terms of what that term GRT means, it's sort of a catch-all phrase for occasionally used for ethnic and non-ethnic groups. But in terms of sort of what we would say is most important when you're delivering services is around those ethnic groups who experience historical discrimination. And so that's why we have begun to use Romani, Gypsy, Roma, and Irish Traveller to really, it's not perfect, because it still obviously does sort of collapse the groups as if they're the same, because we're speaking about them in kind of one fell swoop. But ideally it's to highlight that we're talking about Romani Gypsies, Roma, and Irish Travellers all separately. So I think
gave her an invitation, but with her memory, who knows?
Rona, can you mute yourself, please? We can hear you. Sorry, Grace.
No worries. Yes, so in terms of what damage this can do, I think it's kind of clear when you work to target different communities and their disparities, or you're looking at disparities experienced by communities, you want to know who you're working with. And this GRT caption sort of hides a lot of the disparities because it groups people together who have nothing in common. So for instance, a lot of government data groups Gypsy/Roma. Romani Gypsies are essentially the closest thing that the UK has to sort of like native nomadic people. They came to the UK in the 1500s. They've lived here for that long and they were nomadic for that long. Roma communities, or like what we know as Roma, are more recent migrants from Eastern Europe who experienced ethnic cleansing during the Holocaust and who have severely poor outcomes and treatment on the continent of Europe. So they've migrated to the UK more recently since World War II. And Irish travellers, it's sort of in the name, are from Ireland. They're nomadic communities who are originally from Ireland. And so, yeah, so they have all different kinds of disparities that they face, or barriers that they face. For instance, both Irish travellers and Roma people are also migrant communities. And so that creates barriers. Roma often have difficulties with settled status and migration, whereas Romani Gypsies and Irish travellers not so much. So obviously, as you can see, this means that the GRT label is just a bit broad strokes. It doesn't really work. And it makes delivering really targeted interventions very difficult, because it means that the government is always speaking about three totally different communities, and therefore the services don't really work. So then we sort of talk about policing and the communities. What I also want to say is that although there is a lot of research about them, often in terms of access to data, it's really poor. So policing is one area where it's really poor. We do know kind of recent research that I've been doing, which obviously will not be included in this evidence review alongside Stopwatch, has shown that Irish travellers are 7 times more likely to be stop and searched than the white British population. So that sort of shows a pattern of discriminatory and heavy-handed treatment. And I think what we sort of hear a lot, and what I heard doing that research, was that there's a sort of a perceived risk by police and by the wider community around Romani Gypsies, Roma and Irish travellers. And this perceived risk means that there's often heavy-handed behaviour and discriminatory practices when dealing with communities, even if they haven't done anything wrong. So, for example, what will happen is that one person who lives on a local authority site will either call the police for whatever reason, or the police will be called to the site for whatever reason, and they always come with a contingency of like 8 vans, dogs, riot gear, and it's for a small incident. So you can see there's this perceived risk that happens around the communities, which really damages that relationship between services and them. And then obviously that is sort of the beginning of the long road of disparities throughout the criminal justice system. So it's not just targeted around policing. And I guess in terms of most recent examples of this sort of behavior is last year
Wilfred, shut up.
Last year during November of 2024, the Greater Manchester Police, so essentially a group of Romani Gypsy and Irish traveller children were travelling to the Christmas markets in Manchester. When they got off of the trains, there was a huge, unbelievable, like if you should Google the sort of the videos, there was a huge number of police that had been deployed onto the streets of Manchester under a dispersal order that was explicitly there, or implicitly obviously, to target Romani Gypsy and Irish traveller young people travelling into the Christmas markets that day. One child was taken to the ground and was his neck was kneeled on and he was kicked by the police. Children were forced onto random trains going out of Manchester, the entirety of the Greater Manchester area. Some as young as 9 found themselves hundreds of miles away from home. So all of these different things happened. And when we freedom of information, the original dispersal order, you can see it's sort of littered with racial stereotyping, talking of grabbing, which most people only ever heard about when My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding came out. So those are the sort of things that happen on a big and small scale. And then obviously that is separate to kind of the issues around policing of encampments, all of those different things. So children and young people. Yes, this is one of the most disproportionate areas where most ethnic minorities experience disproportionality in the criminal justice system, and particularly Irish travellers and Romani Gypsies are no different. So Roma have only recently been put on the HMPPS PNOMIS data, and they're I think it's W10, it might be W11. And so the knowledge of Roma communities in the criminal justice system is basically nil. We don't know how many are in prisons. We don't know anything. And I think what's really interesting is like official data from the children's estate puts it around, I think it was 5%, but children in custody reports in particular show that it's about 8% of the population. And those are obviously self-referred, and they go by the term traveller. So again, we don't know whether they're Irish travellers, Romani, Gypsies, or Roma. But a lot of people who kind of go in there report feeling more unsafe than the average population, and experiencing racism from other children and from staff. And we kind of talk about the school to prison pipeline, which is a very long paper, which I suggest you read. In terms of sentencing, this is another area which is quite up in the air. We don't know official data about disparities in sentencing, but we can only imagine, considering high levels of policing, disproportionality in the prison system, we can only imagine that there's disproportionality in sentencing. We did a report on pre-sentence reports, because the Lamy review highlighted their kind of key their key like importance in getting rid of disproportionality in sentencing, because they obviously provide a really good summary to judges and to magistrates from probation officers who should be able to kind of speak to that person and lay out all of the different backgrounds, and give a balanced picture of who the person is. And then obviously means that sentence can be better planned and can be more proportionate. Yes. This report looked at sort of the difficulties with some of those PSR reports, including how OASIS risk assessments are biased towards site living, and that often in the sort of risk reports, they're like littered with racialized language. For instance, some of them will talk about family feuds that they have no idea about or don't exist. They will kind of assume that somebody lives on a site even if they don't. They won't ask about where they live, because most Romani, Gypsies and Irish travellers live in settled accommodation. Only 20% live on sites, and only 2% are permanently nomadic. And no Roma live outside of what we call bricks and mortar accommodation. They're not nomadic at all anymore. They were historically nomadic. Yes. So one kind of key thing was a solicitor that we worked with closely talked about a pre-sentence report, which used the term Billy Boy in lieu of their client's name throughout the report. So what we often hear is that community members are told not to speak in case they hear their accent and are identified as a traveller, because then they will be deemed as a risk factor during sentencing and in prisons. In terms of prisons, obviously, Romani, Gypsies, Roma, and Irish travellers experience discrimination within the prison system. That's quite obvious, I think. But they experience a number of different barriers while in prison. A lot of this is due to access to education or alternative activities or purposeful activities. And I think probably a lot of the things that we hear is difficulties keeping up family ties, wanting to be amongst their own people and hold traveller groups and have traveller equalities representatives, and being denied those things. So a lot of what I hear when I go into the prisons is a lot of the lads saying that they're moved off the wing when they're next to each other because there's too many of your people or those type of people on the wing together. Whereas a lot of people who worked in the prison system will say, actually, it's better that they have their traveller groups and they're on the wing together, because they keep an eye on each other, and they help each other out. There's a real sense of community bonding that goes on sort of in the prison system. Yes. They also are more at risk of self-inflicted death and death in general in the prison system. There's an inquest report on that. Yes. In terms of women, what I will say is that there's very little research into women from the communities in the prison system. So that would be important to look into. Yes. So I'm going to just stop my kind of brief overview. Sorry if that was a bit disjointed, but I know Sam has some questions.
No, not at all, Grace. Thank you. These are quite hard because you write a brilliant piece and then we say 10 minutes, go, sum it up. But you've done it perfectly, and it's definitely given us a lot of food for thought. I've read it in great detail. I really enjoyed it, and I had a couple questions for you, which will be no surprise to you because we chatted about them this week. My first question is about the use of the acronym GRT. So you talk about the use of that GRT acronym, which is used by policymakers, and how this can lead to harmful generalizations, poor policy design, and inadequate service provision.
Mhm.
Could you give us some more information about the impact of this on the people that it affects, and what do you think can be done to mitigate the resulting obstacles to effective policy making and service delivery? Sorry, it's a really long question.
Yes. Sorry, I'm gonna be looking at my notes during this. I kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, but I'll go into it a little bit more detail because I knew it was coming. Yeah, so I think, like I said, it depends on who you're working with. So GRT collapses lots of different communities into one. It's certainly the language of state. It's not a language that any community member has ever used. Probably like the most generic term that people would use is traveler, but they would never use the term GRT to describe themselves. And I think our main issue with it is that often within certain departments, it collapses ethnic and non-ethnic groups together. So it can mean Romani, Gypsy, Roma, Irish travellers, Scottish and Welsh travellers, who we do work quite closely with, who are ethnic groups. But then it also collapses things like non-ethnic nomadic groups, such as New Age travellers, showmen, boaters, bargees, van dwellers, which really muddies the waters in service delivery. For instance, a lot of people who kind of choose a nomadic life but are not ethnically connected to the communities will have PhDs or will be highly educated, will have well-paid jobs or anything like that, which isn't to say that a lot of community members aren't well educated or have university degrees. But if you look at the general statistics around the communities, you can see that they have some of the worst outcomes in all of these different areas. And in terms of, when we're talking to services and how we compel them to do something to fix these disparities, we talk about the Equality Act. We talk about their public sector equality duty. We talk about all of these things which are like a duty upon public bodies to act into and get rid of racial disparities. And when you add in non-ethnic groups into that, it muddies the water a lot and means that it's difficult to act. I think in terms of how it makes community members feel, more recently, some kind of services and public sector groups are using the term nomadic communities, which again is another kind of GRT, is sort of word soup, I would argue. And what you can kind of hear from the communities is a sense of their identity, their culture, their traditions, and the discrimination that they faced is being erased and is being collapsed into like this sort of word soup of nomadic communities, and particularly because most of them are not permanently nomadic anymore. And the reason they're not permanently nomadic anymore is because of legislative action by the government to stop them being nomadic. So I guess I guess the kind of most stark example of this is obviously in site provision. Now we don't work too much kind of in planning policy, because there's lots of different organizations who do it and do it much better than we could. But kind of a stark example of this is everybody knows the sort of community outcry and panic and the like whipping up of the community panic by local authorities and by local representatives when a suggested site is proposed in the area. And that's because of historic discrimination based on ethnic background. It's not because people don't like, vans or chalets, in the area. And so what has recently happened is that people who live a van life have been given a site in Bristol. And I guess what community members would be afraid of is that due to racism, they will not be allowed to live their culturally appropriate life, but people who choose to be nomadic will be given access to things that they've been fighting for historically for hundreds of years, due to the fact there's no racial discrimination baked into that request. So I guess that can show sort of some of the policymaking and service delivery obstacles that happen. And I guess if somebody went into prison who is not an ethnic community member, or for instance, Romani, Gypsies, and Irish travellers might have more in common, but Roma people need interpreters. They might need special access to things. The women will need different kind of services provisions than Irish traveller women. And for instance, a lot of times they'll have like traveller or GRT groups in prisons, and that doesn't feel like something that a community member would go to, because it's not language that they use, it's not language that they recognize, and they could go, and people who have totally different experiences than them, and all they share in common is that they used to be nomadic, and will be in that room. And I think it just shows sort of a lack of care. Yeah. So there you go.
Thanks, Grace. I particularly like your use of the phrase "word soup." It really helps to give it colour. That was really helpful. I have one of my kind of sillier questions next, which is, if we're looking at wider racial disparities across the criminal justice system, and you had a direct line into the Lord Chancellor, or the Deputy Prime Minister, as we must call him, what would you be telling him to do in order to address racial disparities?
Yeah, I think this is quite a big question.
Very big question.
I mean, theoretically, I would tell him to read his own review of the criminal justice system and racial disparities.
Good answer.
But I think, in my opinion, it's about early and proactive intervention. I think at the moment, what we're sort of hearing is that they want to ensure that racial disparities are kind of baked into the rest of their interventions in the system. And I just think that that's not enough. I think they need to be more proactive. Yes, they need to be more proactive in terms of mitigating racial disproportionality. They can't just hope that they change some other things in the system and it alleviates racial disproportionality. It needs to be a much more like active thing. And so I think, Sam, we sort of talked about this around the pre-sentence report bill, and a lot of the panic and the talk about two-tier justice that happened around that bill. And what we spoke about was that it was very disappointing, because it felt like it had no evidence. Like the evidence, I think when we spoke to policymakers, what we said was, it's not controversial to say in the criminal justice sector that there is racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system. It's not controversial. And I guess to continue to act as if that is controversial is a disservice to all of the work of the people who work in the sector for years, all the people who have been at the hands of the system, who can speak about the disproportionality that they faced. And I think the Lamy method of explain or reform is the method to use, and being much more proactive. I also think it's a question of working across government, not siloed working, making sure you're linking up with DFE and DWP and all of these different organisations that can actively work to alleviate the stress on the criminal justice system earlier on, rather than waiting until people get trapped in the system.
Thanks, Grace. I have, it's a relatively selfish question, my last question before we hand over to Russell. So, sticking with the term racial disparities, how do you think the voluntary sector can more effectively influencing policy within the context of the fact that race covers so many different areas and groupings? What can be done better to ensure that the views and the needs and the experiences of all those different groupings are reflected in policy making and service design?
I guess I guess I have a bit of a challenge or criticism of the sector at the moment, which is something I've noticed in my time here, which is in speaking about racial disproportionalities, I do think the sector often leaves out the communities that we work with. They're not core to the conversations, and this is not just the criminal justice sector, it's across all different policy areas, despite the fact that the communities often have some of the worst outcomes in areas. They do often experience kind of an erasure, and I guess it's because they're perceived as being white, and so the idea that then people don't really think about them in terms of racial injustice or racial justice in general. So I think it's about making sure that the work of the sector is backed up by the data, but also it's backed up by cross-working. And, this is not to say that every kind of criminal justice organization is like this, but I do think if you look at a lot of the reports that talk about racial disproportionality in the justice system, you never really see Romani Gypsies, Roma or Irish travellers. It's usually just kind of the organizations that work with those communities that speak about them. And so mainstreaming that conversation is a really big part of our work, and trying to get people to speak about the communities always when they're talking about disproportionality. So I guess that's maybe a roundabout way of answering your question.
It's a very good way of answering the question, and I also appreciate the honesty, because it's kind of not self-critical, but critical of the wider sector in terms of what could be done better. Because though decisions are not ours to make, how we advocate for the needs of the groups that we're talking about is within our gift. And I think there's a lot more we could do as a sector to try and up these issues, up the agenda, because we know how difficult it's been, particularly in the context of the last couple of years.
Yeah,
Grace,
and I just want to quickly just say as well, as I've noticed when people, Katuna, who works with the Xavier Bar Trust, not being included in this conversation, but a lot of people who work in prisons don't actively try and include like the communities either. So I'm scrolling through the comments and I can see somebody speak about this, about making sure that people from the communities have a voice when they're in
absolutely.
prison, when they're out of prison. And I think a lot of organizations that work with prisons don't ever go and knock on the doors and say, hi, are you particularly, like, are you an Irish traveller? Are you a Romani Gypsy? Can I set something up for you? It's when people, like, most people don't think about it, and it's only like a few prisons who are doing really, really great work that have the groups and go out and meet them and talk to people. Yeah, so I think it's really important that we just mention that as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that is the end of my grilling, Grace. Really appreciate your openness and your knowledge on all these questions. I am now going to hand over to the second most important person here after Grace, and that is Russell Webster. Russell.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, well, I don't think I'm the second most important people here, but there's lots of people that are really keen to learn more in the comments, kind of, Grace. There's a number of people asking where's the best place for people to increase their own understanding and knowledge. And I know that at the end of the review, you have included some examples of best practice.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, as you've just been saying, is about people making the effort and having conversations and really making people from these three different backgrounds aware that people are interested, people do know. Celebrating some of the cultural events, I think, is a really good way just to advertise. Yes, we do know there'll be people in this prison, can we help you? Can we get you together? And I noticed Michelle Kay, who I'm sure you know, Grace, has put a helpful resource in there, which is a Friends, Families and Travellers report from this year called Trapped in the Turnstile. You'll find the link in the chat, everyone, if that's what you're wanting to do, which is gives voice to the experiences of 91 different people in prison from Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities in 19 different prisons. Michelle, I don't know if you wanted to say just a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Well, I can't take credit for it because it's my colleague Sam Worrell who did all of the research for this. So we ran focus groups in, as it says, like 19 prisons across the UK. We spoke to prisoners, and we also spoke to friends and family. And I would echo a lot of what Grace has said. That unfortunately inherent racism, discrimination, also years of being treated very differently by authority. You know, we spoke to people who at the age of 5 saw their father or uncle dragged away, or and constant moving on, constant sort of harsh, very harsh treatment by police and other authorities, local authorities, etc. Meant that it was inbuilt in the psychology, the actual psyche of a number of prisoners, that they were not good enough, not as good as other people in society, were probably on their road to following their uncles or fathers to prison. It was quite common to sort of feel that it was a normal thing for family members to end up in prison, and no doubt they would as well. And so when somebody mentioned, one of the participants mentioned about mental health, you've got to consider that you're already dealing with those mental health issues before somebody even does a crime or even ends up in prison. And this is what we heard from a lot of the people that we spoke to. So the experience of going through the criminal justice system, it was very important to have other people around them that understood that, particularly not being separated from people within their own community. And Grace referred to that there are a number of different communities as well. So the term GRT we tend not to use as well. And within Gypsies, Roma, travellers, there are a number of different separate communities, and it is important to link people up within that and provide pastoral and otherwise support within the prison system for those individuals.
Thanks, Michelle. And I can see that Grace has also put the link into the Traveller Movement, which has got a whole range of research and resources on there. The nature of the evidence library is that it's a short summary, but Grace has put within that review lots of links to much more substantive bits of work. A lot of people have asked about do we have data in terms of different discrimination around community orders, IPP, mental health service access. And I'm guessing, Grace, and I'm more than happy to be corrected, but really what you said at the start, which means that the ethnic recording categories don't make sense, aren't relevant, aren't filled in, aren't accurate, means that although we can certainly presume there's massive discrimination and difficulty accessing a whole range of services, we don't have particularly reliable data on any of those kind of detailed areas as opposed to the bigger area of overall discrimination. But please correct me.
Yes, so complicated. So in terms of mental health, so any health data, the NHS data dictionary does not include the terms Romani, Gypsy, Roma, Irish Traveller. I think that might have changed this year. But there's no backdated health information about the community. So all we have access to is the census data, which tells us that the communities, particularly Romani, Gypsy, Irish Traveller, have a life expectancy 12 years younger than the white British population, which is quite drastic. So that's in terms of health, yes. In terms of prison, for the prison research, our research available not accessible, which was about purposeful activities in prison and access to purposeful activities. That kind of goes into a lot of the mental health issues that communities experience, And that was particularly around Romani, Gypsy, and Irish traveller men in prisons. We do have a report on women in prison, but it's old but still relevant, and that includes Roma. I think we worked with Roma organisations. And then but yeah, specific about community orders, funnily enough, actually, my current research is about sort of antisocial behaviour legislation, community protection notices, dispersal orders, all of these different things. So that will be released sometime in the new year. So yes, so in terms of the frequency of use, we can see that they're used more frequently and with worse outcomes. There's a piece of research done by Caroline Hunter on the use of injunctions and the disproportionate use of injunctions, which didn't even specifically look at Romani Gypsies and Irish travellers. But you can see that they experience much worse outcomes upon the breach of an injunction than any other ethnic group.
Thanks very much, Grace. A number of people are, I think, feeling perhaps that their organisation doesn't do everything it could and would like to make a difference. And a number of people have asked whether there are particular organisations that are working in prisons at the moment where they could start their journey with, in terms of learning more and helping to make their services more accessible.
I think probably the best thing to do is to sort of reach out to us. I'll put my email in the chat, and then we can maybe organise to run some training, to do some information evenings, to give you anything that you kind of need. In terms of people who work in prisons, specifically with the communities, it's probably just the Zaid Mubarak Trust. Obviously lots of different organizations work in prisons and probably do work with community members, but people who go out of their way to kind of to help the communities, in my experience, is the Zaid Mubarak Trust. And kind of during my time of the traveller movement, I have visited a lot of prisons. Zaid Mubarak Trust, I'll link it in the chat. Yes, so I've gone to a lot of prison visits to kind of meet with people who are doing really, really good work in prisons. And so that would be God, I can never remember the name of this. There's the Irish chaplaincy, I think it's Irish Prisoners Abroad Service or something. And there and a lot of individual chaplains or individual chaplains or individual EDI officers are doing great work in prisons, but it really varies so drastically.
Thanks very much, Grace. Thanks very much. And again, I see Michelle has put some more information in to say that Friends, Families and Travellers are doing a follow-on project to the one that she spoke about earlier, to produce guidelines for prison staff, co-produced with people from Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities. So there's, again, that contact and email is in the chat. So Sarah Baker's put a number of kind of comments on sharing her lived experience. Sarah, I absolutely don't want to put you on the spot, so this is a genuine question whether you would or wouldn't like to share some of those with the people on the webinar. Absolutely fine, whichever way around you decide on that.
I think that would be great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. Can you hear me?
We
Yeah,
can,
we can hear you,
fire
Sarah.
away.
Listen, I'm really lucky. I'm luckier than I deserve, and anyone who Googles my name will know that. But, it's a big but, there are lots of travellers in prison that no one knows about. I don't know much about people actually from Romania or French gypsies or Belgian gypsies that we have in this country, but there are loads of us, and we are everywhere. We are lawyers, we are barristers, we are solicitors. We are not just we're not scum. We're not. And we won't tolerate it. There are many travellers out here who, like me, who have great privilege, who have I have a better life than almost any other living person that I know. I'm on television 3 times a week. I wrote 4 books, but I did 30 years in prison. I did my own castration because I couldn't get treatment for my gender dysphoria. There's over 50 transgender gypsy prisoners that no one thinks about, no one talks about, no one refers to. I can't get no support for any work for them, or when I travel to visit them in prison. Lots of travelers in jail, their families live on sites, or their families are living in trailers. They're traveling. You can't keep the family contact together, especially if you're in prison and there are no jobs, there is no meaningful activity. I was listening with great interest to what Grace Preston was saying. You're not asking the boys what they want. You're not asking the gypsy boys what they need. You're using an educated view on a community and trying to figure out how you can manage these people within our criminal justice system who, when they get out of prison, every person who know on this page, right, knows what I know. The rents have shot through the roof. Now, if you come from a gypsy community and you live in a trailer and you're being told that upon release, you have to go and live in a studio flat in somewhere like Deptford or Chapeltown in Leeds, and you got to stay in that place, you got to stay in this building, and you're going to be trapped like a house person. Now, I mean, the term we use is gorge of bread. You know that, Grace, yeah. Do you know what I mean? You've got house people, you've got people with degrees, middle class educated people, or working class people who've managed to get themselves a good education through Open University, prisoners who got their education pretty much funded through the Prisoner Education Fund, which no longer funds degrees for people. There are gypsies in there who are smart. There are gypsies in there who know about calculus, who know about physics, who know about quantum physics. Do you know what I mean? The gypsy community that has as many good people, bad people, neutral people, builders, like I say, we are everywhere. People don't know. As many of us have assimilated into the mainstream society, mainly by force, mainly by coercion, being told, no, when you get released from prison, no, you can't just go and live in a caravan on a site with your family down in Abbey Wood. You're told you've got to go to a bail hostel for 6 months. And then when you go from there, you have to pay £1,700 a week to live in a studio flat in Deptford, where you lack motivation. And although you've just come from a system which is full of broken people, society's going to make you even more broken when they give you lots of leaflets, they give you forms, they say you have no banking history. For some people, they have no birth certificate. The minute they step foot out of prison, they're fucked. You know that. There's no point playing about with this, you know what I mean? If you care about transgender prisoners, or not trans prisoners, sorry, that's the different stuff I do. But I'm saying, if you care about the gypsy community as a whole, you need to go in there with sincerity and say, look, we're not going to try and change the way you live, but we're going to present you with occupations and opportunities, and we are going to give you an opportunity to play a bigger part in mainstream society, in mainstream politics, and especially within the Ministry of Justice.
Sarah,
there are a lot more
seems like quite a good message to end on, Sarah.
Sorry.
No, that's
I have a
absolutely
borderline
fine.
personality disorder too. I'm sorry. I'll shut up now.
Nothing to apologise for. But
Okay, thank you.
I do think there's lots of interesting issues there, not least that obviously at the moment a lot of people are being released early because of the prison overcrowding, but to do that, the home detention curfew and the early release, requires a fixed address, which Sarah was saying there, Grace, that's just not appropriate for people that have been living in a community. Would you care to kind of add anything to what Sarah said there, Grace?
Yeah, you hear that a lot in lots and lots of different contexts. In terms of a lot of the lads that I spoke to when I was in prison, or not in prison, but in visiting the prisoners, a lot of the lads that I spoke to there spoke about how they do find the being confined much more stressful than sort of the average person. And they also spoke about that disconnection from family, the disconnection from community, really deeply stressful, which is why they all like to be put on the wing together. They like to be together, but often because of discrimination from prison guards and the wider kind of prison system, they're forced to separate. That's another reason why a lot of them don't self-identify, because they're afraid that they won't be put on the wing together, or they'll be moved off the wing, or they'll be discriminated against by prison officers. So there's just a lot of things that go on there in the prison system, that really strips away the humanity of obviously everybody, but particularly of the communities that we work with.
And it does feel we do have a lot of learning from other discriminated groups as well, in that we know that Muslim prisoners, who again like to be together in terms of feeling supportive, being with people that talk to each other, can be characterized as being gang members, and I know that you mentioned that in the review as well, that there's a kind of all these kind of negative stereotypes and stigma tends to get amplified and exacerbated within the criminal justice system, where there is a starting point for some parts of the system to presume that people are all bad, as opposed to having done a bad thing.
Yeah. And I think there's a real misunderstanding as well of any good diversity and inclusion worker that I've ever spoken to, or chaplain, says actually they would rather they all be together, because they do just get on really well. There's a real sense of community. They really support each other. They really want each other to do well. And obviously that's again another kind of blanket statement there, which we don't really want to do. We don't want to say that, not every person from the communities gets on with each other. But I think breaking down those negative stereotypes that often kind of go through the prison system, that I've seen in the prison system, it's really important.
Thanks, Grace. I'm not seeing anything new in the questions. Oh, hang on, there's someone just come in. Just Karen McGuire asking whether either yourselves as an organisation or FFT have been invited in at all by HMPPS in order to do some training and awareness for prison staff, some cultural training and awareness. I think that's your question, Karen.
Yeah, we work closely with HMPPS head office, but no, often yes, no, we haven't been offered to do training with individual prisons. We'd be happy to do it, but I do think it takes much wider. I don't think it's just about cultural awareness. I think it takes system change. And actually I think one of the prisons that I went to, what the lads were keen to do was to do their own cultural awareness training, which I think could really go really far. And they were really passionate about it. And yeah, obviously, I don't know, I think it's really interesting to kind of speak to them and see, like, they're quite passionate about people knowing about their culture, and they want to talk about it, and they want to champion it. So I think maybe that would be a suggestion, because we are only a small organization, so possibly getting to every prison would be a little crazy. But yeah, as Michelle said, we sit on the HMPPS's disparities group, steering group, to steer through. For years we've worked on the racial action plan within HMPPS, and helped develop that action plan. And now we sit on a steering group with a group of other organisations, including FFT, to make sure that that action plan goes through correctly.
Lovely, thanks, Grace. And I'd certainly endorse what you said about ZMT as well, who have just celebrated their 25 years, and which has given them the kind of momentum to relaunch a manifesto for action on race equality in prisons. And that's very much an open movement looking to involve anyone that is committed to making a difference. It's very inclusive, there's no membership rates, etc. And as Grace said, even though their roots are in the racist murder of an Asian young man in Feltham 25 years ago, they are very kind of inclusive and don't look to prioritise one discriminated group over another. Grace, did you want a final word to say anything before I hand back to Sam?
No, I think I've spoken enough.
Lovely. Thanks very much for that. Thanks for engaging with so many people. Thanks everyone for sharing so many resources and swapping comments in the chat. That's I think really the value of this sort of event. Sam?
Thanks, Russell. Thanks, Grace. There's never too much, Grace. We really appreciate you taking the time today. I know this is one of your last gigs before you move on to an exciting new role, so we really appreciate you coming today. I probably shouldn't admit this. I always worry when we do the evidence library reviews because I'm thinking, you know, will people be interested? It doesn't matter what the topic is. I know how busy all voluntary organisations are, but every single time I am surprised by the sheer amount of interest in terms of the numbers of people that have come today, but also looking at our analytics on our website, the people that have read the review itself. We really do appreciate it. You know, there may not be tangible outcomes from these sessions, and apart from the learning aspect of things, but this really helps us in our kind of ongoing advocacy around the issues covered. So using the A word again, I really appreciate the time everyone has taken to come today, take an hour of their day to come and listen to Grace and hear her respond to your questions. We have another evidence library session due in the new year in February. We haven't advertised it yet, but please do look out for that. It's on a exciting new book authored by Dr. Tom McNeil on public opinion on crime. So we'll be getting that out across our channels imminently. And we will be publishing a recording of this session in due course as well, so that you're able to use it and the review in any future work. So thank you again. And unless there's anything else to add, Russell, Grace, I can...
No, just to say that someone has put Emily Watson has dropped another resource in the chat list, especially if you're in the Essex area. So again, great to see everyone sharing those.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day and a good rest of the week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks all. Thank you, Grace. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everybody.